All right, and probably one of the bigger ones, and we will probably need to speak about this in a separate topic altogether, it's so big, is the need to give or receive forgiveness. This is the deeper, sometimes the darker, these are the painful parts. These are those injuries that stick, sometimes traumas, secrets, shames, this kind of thing for some people, or long-term resentments for other people. The things that never got better, I suppose. They've left their mark. They linger. Sometimes things that lack closure. So, for example, I can remember a man who had a sister who had wrestled with a psychiatric illness, a very bad psychiatric illness, and some bouts of addiction kind of strewn throughout that. And she had placed enormous pressure on the family. There was a lot of strain that came as a result of that, particularly on their mother, whom he loved. There were frequent kind of crises, and plenty of upset and kind of grief around some of her choices and the way that she would relate. And he carried an enormous amount of resentment towards her. He was really angry at the way she had impacted their lives, particularly the mother. And it just never got better. She never improved. They'd hoped, and there'd be moments where they thought, oh, maybe now, or maybe she's turned a corner, and it would just go downhill again. And then one day, she abruptly died of an overdose, and this was a bit of a shock for him because he hadn't actually yet forgiven her for all the pain that she had caused. He still felt this kind of resentment towards her. He hadn't kind of reached that place where he could find a compassionate attitude toward her, and yet it was over, the abruptness of that. So he had to kind of engage with that forgiveness process even after she was gone, and that made it a lot more complex. Now, part of how he had to, the important bit here that I want us to really take away is that we have to engage with this process of forgiveness for sometimes long periods of time, sometimes even after we lose people, Never mind this piece around forgiving the self, which is a whole other big animal, But I think the way in which this man was able to negotiate this after she was gone was he had to really, stare at and look at the pain that she had objectively caused and the reasons for his resentment, and there was plenty of it, and that had to be validated. He was correct to feel angry, correct to be mad. It was appropriate to the situation, But one thing that definitely helped was he would return naturally back to some of the earlier memories from when they were younger. And he would remember moments before she had kind of deteriorated, before she had kind of been really drawn into the throes of her illness. And, he could remember her as she was then, this kind of almost ageless self, in a sense. What he was trying to do was grasp onto her essence before the illness had taken over. And this was a great consolation for him because he was choosing to forgive her, those parts of the illness and the choices that she made in that part. And one of the ways that he was doing this was by grasping onto that essence of who she was, who she possibly could have been in another life, who he chooses to believe she is now. And of course, forgiveness of self is also a very intimate process that we all have to negotiate at some point. There are places there where, we have to learn to be careful with ourselves, gentle, and to extend to ourselves the same courtesy as we might extend to somebody else. That can be longer term work for some people, but very liberating when we do. Very liberating when we do. Now, the most important thing that I want us to understand from these kind of headings of regret, if you want, is that there is, much like with grief, a good way to go about this and a less than good way to go about this. There is the good engagement with regret and the bad engagement with regret, okay? And I want us to think a little bit more about that because that's what's really important here. Okay, so there's good suffering or productive suffering, let's say, of regret. And then there's less productive suffering of regret. And what's the difference? What's the difference between the two? How do we know we're doing this suffering thing right, Because a lot of times we aren't. Now, we are all probably familiar with those action replays in sports. If you've ever watched a sporting event on TV, something happens during the course of the game and they stop, everything stops, and they put in slow motion a certain part of the action in order to see, okay, what really happened? The slow motionness. Now, slow motion is good. There's a lot of benefits to it. What do we get from the action replay? We go back to the start and we see just what happened so that we really understand how to understand this moment, this foul. Should someone get a penalty? What did this player do? Did this player get an injury? And we learn a lot about the game through the action replays. We can kind of see, okay, that player looks injured, We can kind of see morale looks low. And we can make sense of the game as a result of slowing it down and looking at those little intricacies. Now, that's good. That's a good thing to do. And the benefits of this is, we get it. We get the big picture. Now the thing is, the game goes on then. After that, the game moves on. We move back into the action, okay? Now, this is a little bit like an analogy for how we suffer, how we make sense of regret. There are injuries there. You have moments where you get injured. Bad things happen. You do bad things to other people. Margaret called it the inhumanity within our humanity, okay, which is a great way of kind of capturing that. That's all of us. You have fouled people. They have fouled you. You have been hobbling through a game injured and just trying to get through and made mistakes as a result of that. And there can be benefits when you think about your life in slowing it down and doing a bit of an action replay to say, hey, what happened there? What was that about? That's good. That's kind of like good suffering. Because when you're watching it, you're going, ooh, ooh, you can really kind of feel it, But then it's over. Then it closes. All right? That's helpful. And sometimes it's helpful to do that with somebody. Let me tell you what is not helpful, right? What I would call the glitch. The glitch is not productive. And what is that? Okay. At any point while you're watching this, you could probably press pause. And you could freeze the frame. And likely when you freeze the frame, you're going to catch me in some crazy, unflattering position where I look a bit, ridiculous, comical in some way, or I look really bad, or I look, distorted in some way. If you press pause right now, you could probably do it. Don't do it, but you probably could, okay? Now, this is what some people do when they are reflecting on the regrets. They press pause. And they stay there and they look at that frozen image. A frozen image is very different to an action replay. Slow motion is one thing, frozen is a whole other thing, okay? You will never capture the essence or the meaning of yourself or your life by pressing pause. Never, okay? I think this is why the Native Americans were so suspicious about photographic imagery. Right? Remember what they said about photographic imagery? It steals the soul. Now, why is that? Because you can't really see the context of a person or their life or their journey, their in-motionness from one frame, from one picture. And in fact, if you stared at that picture, you could just presume that was the sum total of them. So if you press pause and you stare at that unflattering paused image of me, you could say, oh, that's who she is. Okay, well, that would be horrible. That's what we do to ourselves, though. That's exactly what we do to ourselves. We freeze the frame and say, that's who I am. And then we go over it and over it and over it. Now, if you do that enough, you will distort not just that moment, but all the meaning. You won't be looking at the past in the correct way. You won't be looking at the regrets within all their context. And this will really lead you to a place where you will misunderstand the future entirely and what you're supposed to do. That's not what we want. We don't want you, when you do regret and you do the suffering that comes with it, we don't want you stealing your own soul, so to speak. If you're doing that, psychologically kind of ruminating on it, stop doing that, okay? Some might argue that your soul, or your ageless self, or however you want to understand this, is not yours to steal, right? You wouldn't do this to someone else, so don't do it to yourself.